There is a version of Johnny Carson that everyone knows. The smooth talker. The guy with the perfect smile, the impeccable timing, and the ability to make an entire nation laugh before bed. But that version of Johnny Carson is a performance, and like all great performances, it required hiding something real underneath. The truth is, the man who owned late-night television for 30 years was one of the most guarded, fiercely proud, and emotionally volatile figures in the history of American entertainment. He burned bridges without hesitation. He held grudges like they were sacred. He could destroy someone with a single line on air and never lose sleep over it, or so everyone thought. What most people never saw, because Carson made sure they never saw it, was the raw, unfiltered version of himself that emerged when the camera stopped rolling, when the applause faded, and when the people he worked with or loved pushed him past the point of no return. This is not the story of the entertainer. This is the story of the man, and the 10 most intense, most revealing, most deeply human moments that prove Johnny Carson was never just a host. He was a battlefield. For over 2 decades, Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers shared one of the most important relationships in late-night television. Rivers openly credited Carson with making her career possible. He gave her a platform when nobody else in the industry would. He mentored her, and for years she served as one of his most reliable guest hosts on The Tonight Show. She was sharp, she was funny, and many people watching at the time genuinely believed she was the natural person to take over from Carson when he eventually stepped back. But in 1986, a single decision shattered everything between them, and it was not the kind of rupture that heals quietly. Fox approached Joan Rivers with an offer to host her own late-night show. It was historic. She would become the first woman to anchor a late-night program on a major network, and, no matter how you looked at it, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. But the timing of how it became public created a problem that would define the rest of her relationship with Carson. The network told Rivers that news of the deal would leak to the press within hours, and she made the agonizing decision not to call Carson before that happened. She later explained that she felt trapped by the situation, that there simply was not enough time, and that she genuinely did not want to hurt him. None of that mattered to Carson. When he found out the way everyone else did, through the press, he felt blindsided and betrayed. He picked up the phone when Rivers called to explain, and then he slammed it down. He never spoke to her again. Not once. Rivers spent years trying to reconcile. She reached out through mutual friends, through industry contacts, through every channel available to her. Carson refused every single attempt. In a rare and deeply honest moment toward the end of her life, Rivers admitted that Carson's rejection hurt her more than any bad review or public embarrassment ever could. She did not lose just a professional relationship. She lost a mentor. Someone she had genuinely looked up to and loved in the way that a person loves someone who believed in them when no one else did. The fallout went far beyond their personal bond. Rivers was effectively blacklisted from The Tonight Show for 26 years, long after Carson himself had retired, and the show had passed through multiple hosts. It was not until Jimmy Fallon took over in 2014 that Rivers was finally invited back, and by then the wound had become part of her identity, part of her story, and part of the larger narrative of what late-night television could do to the people who lived inside it. Carson's reputation as a generous and gracious host took a quiet hit because of this feud, and Rivers carried the emotional weight of it until her death. What happened between them was not simply a disagreement between colleagues. It was proof that in the world Carson controlled, loyalty was everything, and once it was broken, even a single misstep could cost you everything in return. Not every clash in Carson's world carried that kind of emotional devastation. Some of them were explosive, chaotic, and genuinely hilarious, even if they started from a place of real irritation. The story of what happened between Carson and Don Rickles is one of the greatest examples of how Carson could take something petty, something almost absurd, and turn it into a moment of pure comedic gold. Rickles and Carson had been friends for decades. Their relationship was built on insults, pranks, and a mutual respect that ran deep beneath the surface trash talk. But in 1976, Rickles made a mistake that Carson could not let slide, even if the punishment he chose was more entertaining than anything either of them had planned. Rickles was taping his sitcom, CPO Sharkey, in a studio right next door to The Tonight Show at NBC. While guest hosting Carson's show one evening, Rickles picked up Carson's wooden cigarette box, a small but cherished personal item that sat on the desk every single night, and broke the lid. It was an accident, but when Carson came back the next evening, noticed the damage, and found out who was responsible, he saw something he loved even more than the box itself. He saw an opportunity. Without any warning, with cameras already rolling, Carson walked off his own set and stormed directly into the middle of the CPO Sharkey taping. The audience had no idea what was happening. And then Johnny Carson appeared on screen, holding the broken box in his hand, staring at Don Rickles with a look that was half fury, half barely contained amusement. Rickles, a man who had built his entire career on being the one doing the insulting, looked genuinely panicked. Carson grilled him in his signature deadpan style, and what followed was a few minutes of live unscripted chaos that became one of the most celebrated moments in Tonight Show history. Rickles scrambled, deflected, threw himself at Carson's mercy, and squirmed under the pressure while the audience roared. The beauty of the moment was that it was completely real. Carson was genuinely annoyed about the box, but he channeled that annoyance into something brilliant, something that showcased exactly why he was the most dangerous person on late-night television. It was not scripted, it was not rehearsed, and it showed viewers a side of Carson that was raw and unfiltered, a man who could turn his own irritation into comedic masterwork without missing a beat. But not every confrontation Carson was involved in ended with laughter. Some of them were dark, serious, and genuinely unsettling. Wayne Newton learned that firsthand after years of being repeatedly targeted in Carson's monologues. Newton had built himself into one of the biggest names in Las Vegas. He was glamorous, powerful, and fiercely protective of his image. But Carson kept coming back to him night after night, with jokes that went well beyond playful teasing. He mocked Newton's appearance, questioned his masculinity, hinted at connections to organized crime, and ridiculed the persona Newton had spent years carefully constructing. For a while, Newton stayed quiet. He let it go the way most celebrities did when Carson turned his attention on them, because fighting back publicly against the king of late night was not a fight most people wanted to have. But there came a point where Newton decided he was done. He walked into NBC studios and demanded a face-to-face meeting with Carson. What happened in that room was not a conversation. It was a confrontation. Newton, by all accounts, was visibly furious. He told Carson directly that the jokes needed to stop, and he made it clear that if they did not, there would be real consequences. There was no humor in the room, no wink, no smirk, no out. Carson, a man who was almost never challenged, like this in person, was reportedly stunned into silence. Newton left no room for interpretation. The message was received. Almost overnight, Carson stopped making jokes about Wayne Newton entirely. His name simply disappeared from the monologue. For a host who prided himself on his comedic freedom and his ability to say whatever he wanted on his own show, backing down like that was significant. It was one of the very few times in his career that someone drew a line and Carson respected it, not out of affection or mutual understanding, but out of recognition that he had pushed someone past the point where words were the only thing at stake. Carson's habit of targeting people with jokes about their physical appearance created another quiet but lasting rupture, this time with Raymond Burr. Burr was a serious, accomplished actor, best known for Perry Mason and Ironside. He was commanding on screen, respected in the industry, and carried himself with a dignity that most of Carson's guests simply could not match. But Carson repeatedly used Burr as material in his monologues, making jokes about his weight, about overeating, about sluggishness. For the studio audience, it was just another round of celebrity ribbing from the host they loved. For Burr, it was humiliating. He privately asked producers to tone it down. The requests either never made it to Carson or were deliberately ignored, After appearing on The Tonight Show for a second time in 1976, Burr made his decision. He declined every future invitation. He did not make a scene. He did not go to the press. He simply stopped showing up, and he never explained why publicly. Carson never addressed Burr's absence either. The two existed in a kind of cold, unspoken standoff for years, and Burr, for his part, avoided talking about Carson in any interview. What made this situation so striking was how powerfully it exposed one of Carson's deepest blind spots. He genuinely seemed to believe that if the audience laughed, the person being mocked could take it. Burr proved that assumption wrong. His quiet, dignified withdrawal was one of the most effective rejections anyone ever delivered to Carson, precisely because it happened without drama, without headlines, and without giving Carson anything to respond to. It was simply a man deciding that his self-respect mattered more than being on the most watched show in America. Carson's sensitivity about how he was perceived by the public came into sharp focus in 1980, when the New York Times published an article detailing his salary. The piece reported that Carson was earning $25 million a year, positioning him as the highest-paid performer on television at the time. For most celebrities, that kind of coverage might have been flattering or at least ignorable. Carson took it personally. That night, he went on air with a copy of the Times in his hand and spent a significant portion of his monologue attacking the article directly. He called it unfair. He accused the paper of printing false numbers. He expressed genuine frustration over what he felt was a violation of his privacy and a misrepresentation of his finances. The audience had never seen him like this. Carson was known for his composure, for his ability to control every single element of the show, for never letting his guard down in front of a camera. But that night, the mask slipped. His voice was sharp, his tone was bitter, and his irritation was unmistakably real. The moment shocked fans and colleagues alike. It revealed something important about how Carson understood his own image. He had spent decades carefully crafting a persona as a grounded, relatable Midwestern everyman. The idea that a national newspaper had painted him as excessively wealthy, especially during a period when Americans were struggling economically, felt like a direct attack on everything he had built. This was not Carson losing his temper over a minor slight. This was Carson going to war with one of the most powerful media institutions in the country, using his own platform as the weapon, and doing it in front of millions of people. The most painful moment in Carson's life, however, had nothing to do with television, comedy, or public perception. It happened at a celebration meant to honor him in a room full of the most powerful people in entertainment, and it involved the one person whose opinion of him actually mattered in a way that no audience ever could. In 1987, NBC threw a lavish party to mark Carson's 25th anniversary as host of The Tonight Show. The event was star-studded and full of reverence for the man who had become a television institution. But behind closed doors, the evening turned into something no one had anticipated. Carson's middle son, Rick, showed up at the party, and the two of them had an encounter that several eyewitnesses described as an explosion. Carson's relationship with all three of his sons had been strained for years. His obsessive dedication to the show, his deep need for privacy, and his complicated relationship with alcohol had created walls between him and his children that never fully came down. Rick had reportedly struggled for years to connect with his father, and the anniversary party became the moment where that frustration finally erupted. What happened next is not entirely clear, because Carson spent his entire life making sure that his private affairs stayed private. But those who were in the room that night describe a confrontation that escalated from a tense exchange into shouting, with Carson visibly angry and Rick refusing to back down or walk away. Some accounts suggest the situation came close to becoming physical. Carson was reportedly shaken for the rest of the evening and may have left the party early. He never spoke publicly about what happened. His relationship with Rick remained distant and unresolved. And then, in 1991, Rick died in a car accident, just 4 years after that night, before any reconciliation could ever take place. Of everything that has ever been written about Johnny Carson, this chapter is the one that most fully reveals who he actually was beneath the performance. It was not funny. It was not entertaining. It was the quiet, devastating truth of a man who gave everything he had to a show and a career, and who could not figure out how to give the same to the people closest to him. The intensity of Carson's conflicts was not always directed at people he knew personally. Sometimes it was directed at strangers, at guests who dared to challenge his authority on his own turf. Jacqueline Suzanne learned exactly how dangerous that could be. Suzanne was one of the biggest literary names of the 1960s, famous for her scandalous novel Valley of the Dolls, and for the glamorous, unapologetic persona she brought to every public appearance. When she appeared on The Tonight Show, Carson introduced her with a thinly veiled condescension that he barely bothered to hide. He teased her work, dismissed it as sensationalism, and eventually made a remark about her appearance that crossed a line that most guests would have simply swallowed and moved on from. Suzanne did not move on. She kept her composure on camera, smiled through the segment, and let the show continue without incident. But after the taping ended, at a post-show gathering, she walked up to Carson, looked him directly in the eye, and threw her cocktail, a Black Russian, straight into his face. The room went completely silent. Carson, soaking wet and stunned, did not say a word. Suzanne turned and walked out. The story spread through the industry almost immediately, and while Carson never publicly acknowledged what happened, Suzanne was never invited back to The Tonight Show. What made the moment so memorable was not just the shock of it, it was what it represented. In an era when male hosts routinely diminished and mocked the women who sat across from them, Jacqueline Suzanne simply refused to be the punchline. She waited, she chose her moment, and she made her point in a way that no one in that room could ever forget. Carson's jokes sometimes carried consequences that extended far beyond the studio, and one of the most significant examples involved Vanessa Williams. In 1984, Williams made history as the first African-American woman to be crowned Miss America. It was a landmark moment, a breakthrough for representation in an institution that had long been criticized for its narrow and exclusionary standards. When Williams appeared on The Tonight Show shortly after her victory, Carson made a comment during his introduction that referenced the pageant's history of change in a way that many viewers interpreted as dismissive, as though Williams's win was somehow a novelty or a token gesture rather than a genuine achievement. The audience laughed, but the reaction beyond the studio was immediate and harsh. Williams herself expressed real disappointment over the remark, saying it diminished everything she had worked for and ignored the significance of what her win actually meant. The controversy sparked broader conversations about race, representation, and the responsibilities of people who held platforms as large as Carson's. Carson privately acknowledged that the joke had gone too far, but publicly he said very little, letting the story fade on its own. The incident did not destroy his career or his reputation, but it left a mark. It was one of the clearest examples of how Carson's comedic instincts, which had served him brilliantly for decades, could become dangerously out of step with a culture that was changing around him. Years after Carson's retirement, and years after their devastating falling out, Joan Rivers returned to The Tonight Show. It was 2014, and Jimmy Fallon was now the host. Rivers had spent over 2 decades in a kind of professional exile from the show that had once been her stepping stone, and her return was treated as a historic moment by fans and industry insiders alike. When Rivers sat down and talked about her history with Carson on air, she was candid in a way that surprised people. She described how devastated she had been when Carson cut her off, how it had been one of the lowest points of her life, and how she had never fully let go of the hurt. But she also acknowledged Carson's generosity in the early days, the way he had believed in her before almost anyone else did, and the complicated, painful nature of what their relationship had been. The reunion was not simple. It was not a clean slate or a feel-good resolution wrapped up in a bow. It was 2 complicated legacies, one still living, one already gone, finally being placed in the same room again after decades of silence. For Carson's memory, the moment complicated the story people told about him. The man who had seemed so unforgiving, so cold in his grudges, was now being humanized by the very person he had pushed away the hardest. It did not erase what had happened, but it reminded viewers that even the deepest rifts are not always permanent, and that sometimes the only way to understand a conflict is to see it from both sides years later, when the anger has quieted enough to make room for something more honest. Johnny Carson signed off for the last time in 1992, and his final episode was meant to be a celebration. 30 years, the greatest run in late-night history, a career that had shaped an entire genre of American television. But even on that last night, Carson could not help himself. During the farewell, surrounded by friends and former guests, a younger comedian made a comment suggesting that Carson's style of hosting was becoming outdated, that the next generation of late-night television was moving in a different direction. Carson did not let it pass. He pushed back, firmly and with unmistakable passion, defending his record and his legacy against the suggestion that his era was finished. The exchange was not hostile, but it was charged. It was the sound of a man who had spent 30 years building something and who refused, even in his final moments on camera, to let anyone suggest that what he had created did not matter. By the end of the show, his tone softened. He acknowledged that television was changing, that new voices would come, and that the landscape he had dominated would look different in the years ahead. But he also made clear that the foundation he had laid, the standard he had set, would outlast all of it. The show ended with laughter and applause, the way Carson would have wanted. But the argument that preceded it was the truest thing he said all night. It was the sound of a man who was not just retiring. He was refusing to disappear. Johnny Carson was never just an entertainer. He was a man defined as much by the conflicts he created as by the laughter he generated. Behind the charm and the composure and the legendary timing was someone who felt things deeply, held grudges fiercely, and loved and failed in ways that the public was never meant to see. These moments did not diminish his legacy. They completed it. They reminded us that the greatest figures in entertainment are not simply talented. They are human, complicated, and sometimes painfully real.